This presentation is an overview about bilingualism or trilingualism in Hong Kong. This presentation has 4 parts. Yaron will first talk about a history of official language changing in Hong Kong. This part also includes political and geographical factors that affect these changes. And then Xinyi will talk about unique medium of instruction in schools. And then Yixuan will talk about present dilemma of each language. And Huan will finally introduce special education policies for immigrants from other countries.
This part is about the history of official language changing in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a unique city located in south of China. It also has very special historical meaning to China. From 1841 to 1997, Hong Kong was a colony of the United Kingdom and under the governing of the British government because of the signing of the Nanjing Treaty. It was until 1997 Hong Kong returned to China as a special administrative region. As Hong Kong had been governed by British government for a century, Hong Kong experienced a series of changing of language education. In 1858, the Qing dynasty government signed the Nanjing Treaty with British government, which noted that all the government documents should be written in English. This article reviewed the unequal treatment of two languages. English as the dominant language was further confirmed by the ex-government of Hong Kong, Dr. John Hennessy. He said that, based on the political and commercial needs, all governments and schools should be treated English education. From then on, all the schools in Hong Kong used English as their instruction language. As English had become Hong Kong's official language, Chinese was facing difficulty of maintaining and developing. Chinese people had made efforts to try to found Chinese media schools during the 19th century, but finally all came to failures. In 1994, Hong Kong government realized that it should save Chinese from danger and suggested to treat language teaching diversion. At that time, all the schools in Hong Kong could be categorized in 3 types: English as medium of instruction, Chinese as medium of instruction, and the schools contained both EMI, CMI. And Hong Kong had its historical turning point in 1997. It returned to China as an SAR, which meant Hong Kong could have different management system from the mainland China, but it was still a part of China. In 1998, all secondary schools changed their instruction language from English to Chinese. In 1997, the first chief executive of Hong Kong's Special Administrative Region, Tong Qinghua, suggested to treat biliteracy and trilingualism in Hong Kong. Basically, he accepted that all students in Hong Kong can do writing in English and Chinese, and speak fluently in English, Mandarin, and Cantonese. In recent years, Hong Kong was facing the dilemma of two languages. The young people were against Mandarin. They considered Cantonese and English were the languages they wanted to speak, but their English proficiency had declined for years. Hong Kong people were losing both Chinese and English.
Part 2, we are going to focus on the unique medium of instruction in Hong Kong schools. There are 3 main types of local schools in Hong Kong: government schools, aided schools, and private schools. The major difference between government schools and aided schools is financial autonomy, which in many ways also affects decision-making and policy outcomes in individual schools. Private schools are operated and funded in 2 ways. First, the private independent primary and secondary schools (PIS) do not receive any subsidy from the government,
which are solely funded by individual providers, investors, or education trust foundations. Second, the Direct Subsidy Scheme schools (DSS) schools are financed by their individual providers, investors, or educational trust foundations, but at the same time are subsidized or assisted by the government under the Direct Subsidy Scheme in the form of capital grants based on enrollment. The medium of instruction according to the policy in Hong Kong has witnessed three stages according to Chen. The first stage being the colonial government's laissez-faire policy from 1947 to 1997, during which Hong Kong schools had the liberty to choose their own medium of instruction. The second stage is the compulsory mother tongue streaming policy after the handover from 1998 to 2009, which only allowed 30% of government schools and government-subsidized secondary schools to adopt EMI in content area subjects, and the rest of the school used CMI. The clear-cut CMI-EMI distinction has been widely criticized for further stratifying the society. According to Evans, the creation of an elite English medium stream and apparently inferior Chinese medium streams is high-handed, discriminatory, and socially divisive, and Poon considers the mother tongue streaming policy led to a decline of English standards and a lack of students' motivation to learn English. In response to the negative feedbacks, in 2010, the Education Bureau adopts the fine-tuning MOI policy by removing the labels of EMI and CMI schools. The new policy brings flexibility and greater autonomy to public schools as they can decide whether English or Chinese or both of the languages be the medium of instruction based on the language abilities of their students and teachers, as well as the support measures at the schools. Under the impact of mainstreaming Chinese in primary and secondary education, the phenomenon of code mixing and code switching became evident in universities. Research indicated that English was used mainly in talking with lecturers, in discussions during tutorials, and in reading and writing, whereas Cantonese mixed with English was used outside lecturer tutorial rooms. And the main reason for using code mixing in some English medium schools is that the English standards of students have not reached the threshold level. And that brings us to part 3, present dilemma of each language. Overall, biliteracy and trilingualism is hard to attain for the majority students in Hong Kong. As is pointed out in Wang and Kirkpatrick's paper, the majority of the schools use Cantonese as the major MOI in most subjects, except the English subject and Putonghua subject. The DSS schools are predominantly EMI schools. Since most students in Hong Kong learn English as an ESL learner, the problems they are facing are identical as that of mainland China. The service schools found that finding qualified and suitable teaching staff was the biggest challenge. Around half of the schools also found that students' low level of English standards has hindered the implementation of trilingual education. Furthermore, the language status of English or Chinese in Hong Kong derail from the ideal of bilingualism, which implies equal importance in both languages. The reality is a sharp contrast between the elites, who take possession of English as a privilege, and a majority who speak mainly Cantonese with very limited proficiencies in English and Mandarin.
Since 1997, the power of English and Chinese Mandarin has shifted. Before 97, English was the official language and people had to use it in both formal and informal settings. But nowadays, people still use it in economic and political areas because Hong Kong is an international city and they want to keep it as a very competitive city in this whole world. And Chinese Mandarin is used in more and more settings like educational and political system and also in media. But Cantonese is used more in social and daily settings, like between families and friends. So some people, they started anti-Mandarin protest. They want to keep the influence of Cantonese in more settings through these protests, and they want to draw people's attention on Cantonese nowadays. The status of Chinese Mandarin is actually downgraded by government and policymakers because enrollment in English medium schools is restricted in number. So enrollment in Chinese medium schools become inevitable. And so English medium schools become the desired choice of most students and parents. This is evidenced by people's persistent efforts to seek admission into English medium schools and the triumph expressed by those schools that were authorized by the government. It is believed by many people that the use of a target language as the medium of instruction will facilitate students' command of it. And because only 114 schools are authorized to teach in English, they are considered as the most distinguished schools. So Chinese medium education has been downgraded to second-class education in people's mind. Scholars in Hong Kong, they have concerns about this situation, and they argue that language serves to develop identity. It is not just a method of communication. It's closely linked with who we are. And for Hong Kong people, speaking their own language, like Cantonese and Mandarin, is about being Chinese, and language is the means of demonstrating its speakers' ethnic, linguistic, and cultural identities. So Chinese is indispensable to school education and cultivate young citizens. And Chinese is the official language of China, and the spread of Mandarin in Hong Kong contributes to the merging and reunion of Hong Kong with mainland China. But it's not to the interest of Hong Kong if Chinese is reinforced in education at the expense of English, because English is needed to retain ties between Hong Kong and the international community. And what happened in Hong Kong right now might simply be a repetition of what eventually happened in Nigeria and Ghana when colonial powers packed up and went home. And the policymakers of Hong Kong might have overlooked an advantage of bilingual education. Hong Kong scholars, they promote bilingual education because researches show that bilingual children possess different modes of self associated with different languages, and language learning and narrative interactions more generally take place in culturally organized communicative contexts that transmit to children not only linguistic and communicative skills, but also cultural knowledge and competence. For example, when sharing memories with their young children, Western moms often focus on the child's roles in the past event and encourage the child to elaborate on his or her own perspectives. This child-centered, elaborative style facilitates children's detailed remembering of personal experience that highlight their uniqueness and socialize the children into an autonomous sense of self. But Chinese moms often focus on shared activities, important others, and social norms, and expect the child to answer pointed questions without elaboration. And this group-oriented, pragmatic style helps children develop a sense of belonging and social compliance, but downplays the construction of elaborate personal stories and a unique individual identity. And language is critical to the development and maintenance of a culture self. And for bilingual children, learning to speak two different languages equips them with multiple tools of constructing the self in relation to the socio-cultural world. And developing different representations of the self in relation to different languages may further provide them with the flexibility to respond effectively to different cultural and linguistic contexts that they transition in and out in everyday life. The average TOEFL or English language test scores may indicate that Hong Kong lost itself in 3 languages. In colonial period, the average TOEFL score of Hong Kong was top in Asia. It was better than Singapore, which is another UK colony in Asia. After 1997, the score dropped a little bit, but Hong Kong was still better than Taiwan, Singapore, China, and other Southeastern Asian countries. But recently, the score dropped a lot, and Hong Kong is lower than Singapore, lower than Taiwan, and even lower than Beijing and Shanghai. Hong Kong people were so proud of themselves because of their good English skills, but now English is becoming a pain and a shame. Because of the long existence of code switching in the history of language changing, people in Hong Kong actually speak English in a very special way. And here are some examples. First one, sabo literally means the soup pot in Cantonese, but it is also short for sabotage from English. So people might say, you sabo me, which means you sabotage me. And the second one, no IC. And the little I in the middle is actually short for eyes. So the whole phrase actually means it is so embarrassing and I don't want to see. And the last one, you so pro. In fact, it means you're so professional, but people make professional short as po.
In light of the existing problems, the future implications for the bilingual or trilingual education, according to Wong and Kirkpatrick, include delinking immersion from school status and prevent labeling of schools and students, professional development program, and long-term support for schools and teachers.
Hong Kong is a home to diverse ethnic groups. To ensure the equality of access to education is particularly important for immigrant children in Hong Kong. The government conducts a population census every 10 years. The most recent Hong Kong population census was conducted in 2011. According to the demographic data, Hong Kong's non-Chinese population represents 6.4% of the whole population, and the largest ethnic minorities are the Indonesians and the Filipinos. As ethnic minority groups, the immigrants are facing difficulties in pursuing education. They had limited choice of schools and could only attend a few primary and secondary schools in Hong Kong, which used English as medium for instruction. Most primary schools in the public sector use Chinese as their medium for instruction. Apart from the public schools, the international schools in Hong Kong are not within the reach of the working-class families as they cannot afford the school fees. Worse, without up-to-date information in a language they can understand, ethnic minority parents are poorly placed to make well-informed choice about the education of their children. Besides, the lack of funding and support from government often means that teachers could not cater for ethnic minorities, whose background and Chinese language ability would vary greatly when compared to local students. Among these difficulties, the language is a major obstacle for ethnic minority students. The problem of language has some negative influence on the overall learning experience of immigrant children at school, especially when other subjects apart from language are taught in Chinese. The fact that immigrant students have a generally much lower standard in writing than reading also echoes with the requirement of two separate systems of learning. There are no appropriate Chinese textbooks in the market targeted at ethnic minority students, and consequently, schools have to come up with their own teaching materials. There has not been any comprehensive Chinese as a second language policy. Further, there is no such framework for kindergarten-level education. The problem causing ethnic minority students failure at the end of their secondary schooling career is that students have to take the Hong Kong Diploma of Secondary Education, the DSE public examination. The curriculum for the Chinese language subject in the DSE examination is designed to be difficult, even on the standards of local students who are native Chinese speakers. Because of the difficulties in catching up with Chinese language education, ethnic minority students often choose alternative qualifications in the Chinese language, such as the General Certificate of Secondary Education in Chinese, GCSE, but it is not reliable enough to be accepted by the public. The Hong Kong government bears the responsibility to guarantee equal access to education for all children without discrimination. There are two policies in Hong Kong that can be identified as primary determinants of ethnic minorities' education. The first and most influential policy is the Race Discrimination Ordinance, which has passed into law in 2008. The other policy is the principle of no losers in the classroom, which was implemented under the education reform in 2000, whose principle reflects the educational aim to cater to the diverse learning needs of individual students. However, it remains unclear how teaching and learning might be better focused to promote learning for ethnic minority students. In 2013, an ethnic minority representative brought the matter to the attention of the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. Members of these organizations expressed concern over the impact of isolation and exclusion of ethnic minority children from mainstream schools due to their poor Chinese language skills. They suggest the government to ensure the equal access to quality education in schools and the opportunities to have adequate Chinese language skills, also to find good solutions from successful examples around the world. The chief executive of Hong Kong stated in his 2014 policy address that starting from the academic year 2014 to 2015, the Education Bureau will introduce in all schools the Chinese language curriculum second language learning framework, with a view to bridging ethnic minority students over to mainstream Chinese language classes. The learning framework introduced measures regarding curriculum development, training and resource for teachers as well as monitoring and evaluation. According to the Hong Kong Education Bureau, a series of measures are offered to step up the support for non-Chinese speaking students to facilitate their effective learning of Chinese and the creation of an inclusive learning environment in schools. The support measures are as follows. In terms of learning and teaching of the Chinese language, diversified and progressively advanced teachers' professional development programs and school-based professional support like expert teams from EDB or university school support programs will be offered to help school implement the learning framework we mentioned before. For non-Chinese speaking students who have a late start in the learning of the Chinese language or have not been given full opportunities to learn the local Chinese language curriculum, the International General Certificate of Secondary Education is accepted as alternative Chinese qualification in consideration for admission to local universities and post-secondary institutions. The government will also offer more funding support to schools admitting non-Chinese speaking students. Under the new admission scheme, non-Chinese speaking parents can approach schools by themselves and the schools have no rights to deny placement to students due to their racial background if they meet their basic requirements. The government also encourages non-Chinese speaking parents to send their children to local kindergartens so as to promote an early exposure to an immersed Chinese environment for the children to smooth their progression to primary schools. There are also several programs aiming to help the non-Chinese speaking students. Initiation Program is a 6-month full-time program for newly arrived children before they enroll into mainstream schools in Hong Kong, aiming to improve their Chinese and English ability as well as to facilitate their whole person growth and social adaptation. Induction program operated by non-government organizations is also designed for newcomers, helping them to promote personal development and basic learning skills. The 4-week summer bridging program has been offered to non-Chinese speaking students to help them consolidate what they have learned and prepare them for transition into a new stage. Through parent-school collaboration, students would be better supported in learning Chinese and enhancing their Chinese proficiency. Coming to the conclusion, Hong Kong has a unique language-speaking environment as a special region. In our presentation, we first reviewed the history of language changing in Hong Kong. Then we introduced the unique medium of instruction in Hong Kong schools. We also analyzed the present dilemma of each language. At last, we introduced some special education policy for immigrants.
Here are some limitations of our research. We can only get data and information from literature and government documents, so the real situation of multilingualism in Hong Kong can be more complicated. And since we're in the US, we find difficulties to get access to the original literature where we find there is no translated version of original literature in English, so we have to translate or interpret by ourselves. Thank you for watching our presentation, and we look forward to your feedback and questions.